Welcome. This is called Let's Deschool Entrepreneurship Education Before We Get Schooled. And I'm aiming at a framework for designing and assessing modern learning for entrepreneurship. Really, at this stage, it's just a set of ideas that I want to share with you. We often speak of entrepreneurship education. We talk about it at conferences, we talk about it in journals, we talk about it in classrooms and in programs and all the rest of it in higher ed. Entrepreneurship education. I want to propose that what we mean is entrepreneurship schooling and that there's an important difference. And on top of that, what society wants and needs, especially in today's day and age, is learning for entrepreneurship and innovation. So we've got these three words: education, schooling, and learning. And they're different. And the differences are becoming increasingly important. I'll put them on the screen together there. And I want to put on the table these lines of thought. I'm not fully subscribed, but I want to place your thinking. Never let schooling interfere with your education. Often attributed to Mark Twain, originally from Grant Allen. And the notion of deschooling of society, and this notion of deschooling that I'm boring a little bit here, parts of it. So let's look at education versus schooling, in particular the education side of things first. And look at some definitions. The action or process of gaining a body of knowledge. Okay, that makes sense. We're trying to pass on a body of knowledge to our students. I'd include in that making judgments about knowledge, applying knowledge, and preparing to construct new knowledge. And with that, if you add those things to it, go the development of the skills and the mindsets that are needed. So that's what education is delivering. Another definition that I love, a little bit different, is another use of the word education, as in that was an education, meaning an enlightening experience. And I like this because to enlighten means to give spiritual or intellectual insight to a situation. We do that in entrepreneurship. The other one I'm going to build upon is this one: a form of learning in which knowledge is transferred from one generation to the next. If you think from the point of view of societies and civilizations, education is that. I mean, we're passing on a body of knowledge from one generation to the next. It might be parent to child, it might be, entrepreneur, successful entrepreneur as advisor to new entrepreneur, whatever it might be. So we're going to build on this one. But first, I wanted to point out, it's interesting because the root of the word actually comes from the meaning to bring up or to rear, which goes nicely with that if you think of it as a societal civilization responsibility. Let's contrast that though to schooling, which can be defined as a formal form or a more formal form of education, usually including teachers, courses, programs, and assessment. I'm not being specific here necessarily to an institution or a physical school, but nevertheless those are the pieces. So education is a form of learning in which knowledge is transferred from one generation to the next, and this happens in entrepreneurship, it happens in science, it doesn't matter. We pass on bodies of knowledge. And schooling is a formal form of that, including those pieces that is from schools to, daycares, to online programs, to extension programs, to our higher education programs of entrepreneurship. But in here we see those three words again: education, learning, and schooling, that are underlined right now. Which brings me to this sort of concept. If we look at all the activities a learner or an entrepreneur can undertake and categorize them, we can say that some of those are learning activities and some are not. For example, learning would be reading a book about entrepreneurship, trying to start a business about entrepreneurship, those kinds of things. Whereas not learning would be a rote activity. Within learning, you've got some of those being education, some of those learning activities being education. And within education, you've got some of those being schooling. So this is the hierarchy, the way I look at the relationship between those words. As I mentioned, all activities could include sleeping. Those aren't learning activities, but there are activities we undertake. Menial tasks, something where you're not learning anything anymore, or just mindlessly jogging on a treadmill. I want to jump down to education, reminding you of that definition, transferring from one generation to the next. For example, parents to child. That's what they do. They're constantly educating with the goal of their future well-being. Storytelling cultures, informal mentoring, reading a book, consuming media, on-the-job learning, and so on. These are types of learning that are meant to help transfer from one generation to the next, whether it's active, like me telling my child something or teaching them something, engaging them, which isn't schooling yet, but is still an educational form, or whether it's more passive, where the learner goes out and learns by reading or on the job. Contrast that to schooling, which, remember, is a formalized form of education. And we have a lot of examples: universities, colleges, centers, programs, courses, apprenticeships, probably formal mentorship, online courses, extension programs, certificates, and so on. So what? Why have we gone through this? Why have we distinguished between these? Well, if you look at these, we can come to a number of things. First of all, schooling does not equal education. They're different things. Schooling is a formal form of it, but they're not the same thing. Two, we very often mean schooling when we say education. And I've mentioned this before, but for example, entrepreneurship education, we're often, I think, really talking about entrepreneurship schooling. Those are different things, and they're important, as we'll get to, because there are so many opportunities for the broader education these days. Our students don't need us, perhaps in the same way they did. Three, there are many types of education that are not part of schooling. Kind of said that in different ways, but it's an important difference. There's a lot of options out there for getting educated as an entrepreneur that don't involve going to a formal schooling program. Four, when we assess outcomes, we're often assessing outcomes of schooling, and those are different from outcomes of education or educational outcomes, and they're different from learning outcomes. Number five, in entrepreneurship, we do try to go beyond schooling. I want to acknowledge that we try to go beyond schooling. We do it better, or as well or better than most. There are experiential activities that try to make it authentic. There are cross-campus initiatives. We have centers. We have entrepreneurship schools, not just departments, but schools these days. I mean, look at Morris and Kratko and what those guys are doing. And we have competencies. We're looking at competencies at the individual level and leading on that. And I'd point to Morris again there as an example. If we broaden to the notion of learning, then we can put in there, if you're not in the education circle, but you're learning, you might argue that you're doing research. So if you're not passing on a body of knowledge to the next generation, but you are learning, then you're probably in the mode of trying to create new knowledge or uncover new knowledge, which is research. So I put that on there because in entrepreneurship, of course, like many disciplines, we look at this. And I'm giving credit here, as I said in the fifth point, to entrepreneurship and what we do. And you might say that schooling is somewhat like this for us. And in there we have programs and centers. I've spelled that the Canadian way, as you can see. And we have co-curricular. And within program and center we have courses. So this is kind of the map. But my sixth point is our focus is still really overwhelmingly on schooling, even despite the way we push the envelope in entrepreneurship. We're still talking about schooling. And worse than that, possibly, or risky, is that most of us are looking just at the courses we teach. Our scope doesn't much go beyond that, or thinking of a program perhaps as a collection of courses. And yet, if you look at the broader picture, we've got education, which is so much bigger, and learning, which is so much bigger. And the point being that entrepreneurs learning have so many options these days beyond our courses. So we put the relationship back on the screen here. I wanted to say, as number 8, there are many schooling alternatives. The college and university is not the only game in town, if it ever was, but it's for a relatively young field. We're now seeing these alternatives, like MOOCs, like startup weekends, like alternative schools. In fact, at the time of saying all this to you, there's a news article I'm thinking of that I read the other night where a school in California is charging some $18,000 to train people to become coders, and they're getting hired more readily than Google, or by Google folks, than regular programs in training people. So schooling alternatives exist, and they're very real. Going back to our original picture again, number 9 is that modern technologies are affording a brand new balance. It used to be that schooling was the way, and I don't just mean entrepreneurship here, schooling was the way to learn. I mean, the textbook that you got was a Bible. I remember growing up with Encyclopedia Britannicas on the shelf that would, as the equivalent of the textbook. That was what was afforded to you. But today, with internet, Web 2.0, cheap travel, telecommunications, you pick it. I've said this a lot, but entrepreneurs, learners generally have access to so many ways of learning that schooling isn't necessarily the focus, and at very least the balance is shifting here. So what? I've said before, so what else? Well, I've said already that we speak of entrepreneurship education, and yet we mean entrepreneurship schooling, and society wants and needs us to be focused on learning for entrepreneurship and innovation, and that the difference between those things are increasingly important. So I want to give you a few perspectives. The first is that of the entrepreneurship researcher, and I'm being stereotypical here, putting people into boxes, so go with it. But this is the way it looks, and this is borrowed from the reference you can see on the bottom there. But entrepreneurship education feeds entrepreneurship activity, which benefits individuals, firms, economy, society, and so on. And entrepreneurship research loops in like that. So we study entrepreneurship activity, we feed that into the educators, and we have this kind of cycle. So that's the perspective, but the point here is that the research is at the center of it. Then there's the teacher curriculum designer perspective. I'm going to modify this picture a little bit. Of course, there's the focus on entrepreneurship education if you're a teacher or a curriculum designer. So that's the box you're looking at. But in an earlier paper I wrote, I modified this a little bit like this and said scholarly teaching, learning, actions, and those feed each other. And then I said, well, what about looking at teaching inputs like curricula, like judges I bring in, like spaces I use, and so on. And teaching outputs like the evaluations of my teaching, for example, and I won't go into all the details here, feeding into learning. The learning happens, and then there are proximal and distal learning outcomes. Proximal we can measure right away, the score they get on an exam, their performance in an experiential activity, what happens when they walk out the door of our classrooms, whether those are virtual or real classrooms. Then some actions happen, and this could be decades long. And then there are distal learning outcomes, and we can see that they've built companies, for example. There might be evidence of it that have great success. We can make links to economic prosperity in the region, those kinds of things by aggregating. So there's this picture that at best, with the teacher view, looks something like this. But despite that, I remind you of point 6 that I made earlier. Our real focus here is still overwhelmingly schooling. I would argue we're missing a bigger piece of the picture, or we're only looking at a piece of it. And the risk is that schooling isn't their only way to access learning. So, come back to my point, a framework for designing and assessing modern learning for entrepreneurship. If we look at this scope, which is what we've been talking about so far, you have input variables, some schooling happens. I'm saying schooling now instead of educating. And then there are some outcomes. I want to expand that. Talk about the outcomes expanding to proximal and distal like I did earlier. And the inputs, start thinking about distal variables, so things way in the past or broad, hard to change characteristics, like fundamental traits that an individual has or so on and so on. And then proximal variables, the stuff that happens right before perhaps the schooling. And I would say that at the time we're talking about the schooling happening, the place where we're interjecting or having an impact, there's lots of other learning happening at that present time. And I like to think about these. The framework I want to give you, the way of thinking is, you got some independent variables in this experiment. You got some mediating variables, the stuff that's happening to try and increase entrepreneurship and innovation and its impacts. And then there are the dependent variables. In other words, you have inputs, the stuff we do, and the outputs. And I have this view of it that looks something like this, and I'm borrowing from the educational psychology literature, this 10-arrow model, and I've adapted it, in the reference in 2010 that I was doing, to looking at it not from the teacher perspective or the researcher perspective, but the individual learning context perspective. And there are all these relationships. I mean, a distal variable a distal, far in the past input can have a great big effect on the distal outcomes. For example, that top arrow you see there. At the same time, it can have a direct short-term or shorter term, a direct effect on proximal or causal. You can have all these relationships from one to the other, and there are 10 arrows there, and that's where that name of that model comes from. But I think it's incredibly important to recognize the system that's at play when learning is happening. This is another way of saying that what happens in the middle dot there, the schooling and other interventions, are not the only piece of the picture, and yet that's where we tend to look. Can we look more broadly than that? So we go from that, which has this kind of scope, schooling, to this model I already put up, which has the potential, I think, to better represent the real but complex learning system an entrepreneur works within today. And I say today because 15 years ago, Google didn't exist, for example. Things have changed quickly. So what about employing that framework to the questions of outcomes and assessment of outcomes? Very briefly, just want to give you some ideas. If we put those variables and outcomes across the top, and then we look at the types of evidence we can gather for the learning that's happening, broadly speaking. There's individual type outcomes. Somebody's more open to ambiguity. Somebody's got a better skill on this, and their mindset has shifted. There's the number of courses we run and seats we fill and so on. Program level stuff like number of years we've been running, number of ventures we've graduated and so on. Center level stuff, which is even bigger than that because of the co-curricular and outreach. Venture level, so forget programs and schooling, talk ventures that are created in society, aggregate those into economy and so on and so on. And then you can map, and I'm not going to read all these to you, but different entrepreneurship literature on outcomes, types of outcomes. Pittaway's stuff, Morris's recent stuff, and I won't name them all as I said, but you can map where these fit. I mean, some of them are individual based, some of them are, course program center based, some of them are looking at, the economy and innovation, like Falkang and Alberti. Morris is looking at competencies more recently of the individual, and of course as well. I should probably extend that a little bit down, but my point is just to be a rough mapping here, that we can relate those things we already know to this broader picture. And from there, ask some questions like, what about other variables? What else plays into this that we're not representing? And it might be under the green here, and other outcomes as well. For example, over here, what do we have that's distal outcomes of the individual or the course or the program, even the center kind of thing? What are the relationships between the things that are in all those papers? I mean, you open any one of those papers, and Natalie Duval-Coutet's paper is a nice summary of some of the elements of it in all those other ones, and this is the reason I picked them, is because of her paper, just to use the same ones. But all those elements that are in those papers, what are the relationships between them? Recall the 10 arrows that I had earlier, the 10 arrow model. So that's one question. Another big one is, how do we measure these? Once we know what they are and we know the relationships between them. Then moving forward to, back to the variables, the inputs, the programs, the schools, the online resources, the policies that are available, or that are the levers people are pulling to try and help entrepreneurship and innovation happen. Your program's but one of those. And I've broadened or generalized it here to individual level, school level, if you will, like schooling, venture level, economy level, and so on. But what are those other inputs? And so are there other schooling options for entrepreneurs? And other education options, other learning options? I've given a couple of examples here, but of course there are a great many of those that exist and that play into things. From learning by experience, through doing your own new ventures, to informal apprenticeship and mentorship, to online resources, to other programs in higher ed, other programs nothing to do with higher ed, like Startup Weekend or weekend apprenticeships or 3-month apprentice programs that you may have heard of. There are online courses like MOOCs. There's all sorts of stuff here, as well as K-12 inputs. So, and how do we fill the gaps? There's that kind of question that I have too. So here are my closing thoughts. College and university entrepreneurship programs are a relatively new thing. Pick it, 35, 40 years, something like that. And I mean the discipline as well. Incredibly deep in terms of their impact, but relatively new. We tend to adopt a schooling mindset in our work as academics in higher education for innovation entrepreneurship. And yet schooling doesn't dominate the learning landscape for anyone the way it once did. And as we go across campuses, because we're doing that, and build schools of entrepreneurship, because we're doing that, we might benefit from a shift in thinking, in language, in design of programs and opportunities for learning, and in assessment, from schooling for entrepreneurship to learning for entrepreneurship. So please let me know what you think. This is the basis of ongoing work. I'm writing this up in different ways. This video has been created to get your feedback. Thanks very much.